The private dining room at Harwood Estates was the kind of room that made people feel that they had arrived somewhere. The walls were pale ivory, the molding was original, and on 3 Saturdays per year, when the long mahogany tables were set with white linen and baccarat crystal and silver that caught the Connecticut afternoon light, the room achieved something it spent the rest of the year only suggesting. On this particular Saturday in May, during the Mother's Day celebration luncheon, 10 tables were set for 40 guests. The catered 5-course service had begun with a cold asparagus veloute. The room smelled of white peonies and warmed bread rolls and the specific quiet that money purchases when it has been held for a long enough time. Elaine Hartwell, 72 years old, longtime social architect of Hall C and the most widely known resident at Harwood Estates, sat at the head of the primary table in a silk dress the color of champagne. Her crystal wine glass caught the light when she moved it. She moved it often. Nathan Wren, 44 years old, sat at the far end of that same table. He had been given the seat nearest the window, which meant the afternoon sun was at his back and everyone else at the table could see him clearly when they looked in his direction. He had not moved his wine glass since it was poured. Elaine Hartwell reached across the table. She moved Nathan's hand away from the wine decanter with the gentle firmness of a woman who has never once doubted that correction, when delivered gracefully, is a form of generosity. "Nathan, darling," she said, "the Richfield crystal is baccarat. I know that's probably not a brand you've spent much time with, but please, just let Claudia pour." The laughter from the table adjacent to theirs was polite and immediate. Several of Elaine's friends had heard the remark and found it delightful. Elaine set her glass back on the white tablecloth and smiled at her dobra. But what Elaine Hartwell did not know, as she smoothed the front of her champagne silk dress and accepted the compliment that one of her friends leaned across to offer, was that every dollar that had paid for that glass, that crystal, that catered 5-course service, that white linen, that table, that suite upstairs in Hall C, and every one of the 1,100 monthly checks that had kept her at Harwood Estates for 4 years was drawn from the Whitmore Legacy Trust, a $12,000 irrevocable Delaware trust with one controlling principal, the man she had just corrected about the crystal, her son-in-law, Nathan Wren. 3 weeks later, Ruth Kane, 58 years old, trust attorney and managing partner of Kane and Associates, walked into that same dining room with a court reporter at her side, a bound forensic accounting package in her briefcase, and a 90-day residency termination notice already signed and dated. There is a particular kind of cruelty that mistakes courtesy for weakness and silence for ignorance. Nathan Wren had been courteous for 9 years. He had never been weak. By the time this story reaches its end, you will have seen a $340,000 fraud exposed transaction by transaction. You will have seen a prenuptial agreement produce the specific silence that only a document can produce. You will have seen a suite at Harwood Estates cleared, a social network recalibrate itself with the efficiency of water finding level, and a set of hotel receipts entered into a public court record. Stay until the end. Every one of those losses has a sequence, and the sequence matters. Subscribe now and drop "trust" in the comments if you believe that what a quiet man chooses not to say is often more powerful than anything he could. On a Tuesday morning in March, 2 months before the Mother's Day luncheon, Nathan Wren was at his oak desk in his home office in Greenwich by 6:30 in the morning. The office was in the back of the house, insulated from the street by a corridor, and a sitting room he rarely used. The desk had belonged to his mother. The window behind it faced a small yard where a birch tree had gone bare in November and had not yet started to think about recovering. Frank Delgado's encrypted report arrived in his inbox at 6:47. Frank Delgado, 51 years old, was the director of trust operations for the Whitmore Legacy Trust. He had held that role for 11 years. He was methodical, cautious with language, and specific when specificity was what was needed. The encrypted report had a subject line that said, "Quarterly distribution review, flagged items, action required." Nathan opened it with his first cup of coffee still warm. He read for 12 minutes without moving. The report documented a routing number discrepancy that had caused a delay in February's payment to Harwood Estates Management Company. The trust distribution account had been updated in October, and the new routing number had not been communicated to Harwood Estates' billing department in time for the February cycle. The result was a pending gap in service. Nathan authorized a bridge wire of $11,800 from his personal account to be reimbursed by the trust in the regular March cycle to prevent any disruption to Elaine Hartwell's residency. He did this without calling anyone. He made a note in his operational log and moved to the next item. He signed 3 distribution authorization forms that Frank had queued for his electronic signature. The first covered the standard monthly support payment for Suite 14B, which Frank had already routed for the March cycle. The second covered a quarterly charitable contribution to a land preservation organization in Litchfield County that the Trust's investment committee had approved in January. The third covered a modest honorarium to a probate attorney in Wilmington who had assisted Ruth Kane with a Delaware filing in February. Nathan signed each one and initialed the disclosure boxes that he had been initialing for 6 years without anyone in his social life knowing what they were. He reviewed the quarterly investment summary. The trust portfolio was returning 6.2% annualized on a diversified mix of fixed income instruments and equity positions. The investment committee had flagged one underperforming position for review. Nathan noted it for discussion at the April review meeting. He made a second cup of coffee. At 7:15, Frank's follow-up arrived. This message was shorter. It was shorter in the specific way that means more is being said per sentence. Frank had been conducting a routine cross-reference of the Trust's distribution request metadata against Nathan's standard submission windows. Nathan's submission pattern was consistent. He submitted authorization requests from his home office on Tuesday or Wednesday mornings between 6:45 and 8:30 using one of 2 registered devices. The metadata for 23 of the distribution requests filed over the preceding 18 months did not match any of those parameters. Not one of the 23 had been submitted from a registered device. Not one of them had been submitted within Nathan's standard submission window. Frank had pulled the IP access logs. The 23 requests had all been submitted from the same IP address, and that address was not in the Trust's authorized access registry. Nathan read the summary a second time. He read it a third time. He set his coffee mug down on the desk to the left of the keyboard, which was what he did when he wanted to be certain his hands were not occupying themselves with anything while he thought. He touched the silver compass in the breast pocket of his jacket. It was a brief, unconscious gesture, the kind a person makes when they have been touching a specific object in a specific moment of stillness for so many years that the gesture has become part of how they return to themselves. He sent Frank one message. It said, "Hold all pending distributions, call me at 9. In the corridor outside the office, at some point between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, Claudia Wren passed the closed office door on her way to the kitchen before Pilates. She was wearing a fitted grey jacket and carrying a water bottle. She glanced at the door. It was closed. It was always closed when Nathan was working. She did not knock. She never knocked when it was closed. She had told herself years ago that this was respect for his concentration. Nathan had known for several years that it was something else entirely. 2 people in the world knew what was in that morning's encrypted report. Frank Delgado, who had flagged it and was already pulling additional records from the archive, and Ruth Kane, 58 years old, trust attorney and managing partner of Kane & Associates, who had managed the Whitmore Legacy Trust since its founding and who received Frank's summary at 7:49 with a single forwarded note from Nathan that said, "Please read Frank's report. I would like your assessment before 9. Ruth read it at 8:03. She called Frank before Nathan did. The rest of the world, including Claudia Wren and Elaine Hartwell and Gerald Hartwell and Dominic Firth, went about their mourning. Eleanor Wren died at the age of 63, 6 years before this story begins. This is a fact that deserves to be stated plainly because what follows cannot be properly understood without it. Eleanor Wren had been a private wealth manager for 31 years. She was soft-spoken in professional settings and precise in a way that was never cold. Because precision, when it comes from someone who cares about the outcome, is not cold. It is a form of kindness. She built the Whitmore Legacy Trust over the course of 3 decades from an original combination of her own family's modest inheritance and the compounding returns of disciplined patient investment. By the time she was diagnosed, the trust held $12,000 in assets. She had set Nathan as its sole trustee and controlling principal 8 years before the diagnosis, when he was 28 and she was still in good health and had no particular reason that she would admit to for needing to make those arrangements. She made them because Eleanor Wren had been a private wealth manager for 31 years, and she understood that the right time to prepare for a storm is on a clear day. She was diagnosed in the early summer of the year that Nathan turned 36. The cancer was identified late, which was her own fault, she told Nathan without self-pity, because she had been busy and had cancelled 2 annual appointments. In the months after the diagnosis, she and Nathan spent a great deal of time together in her study in the house in Westport, which had tall bookshelves on 3 walls and a window that looked out toward the water. She was not a woman who performed sentiment, but she was precise about what mattered to her, and Nathan mattered to her, and so she told him things she had not told many people. On a morning in August, 6 weeks before she was moved to the care facility, where she would spend her last months, Eleanor Wren reached into the drawer of the side table next to her chair in the study and took out a silver compass. It was a nautical navigation instrument, the kind used by a sailor who wanted to know where north was, regardless of what the sky was doing. It had been her own father's. The case was worn to a soft matte finish on the edges where hands had held it for years. She held it out to Nathan with both hands, the way you give someone something that is not a gift, so much as a transfer of custody. "A compass doesn't argue with the storm, Nathan," she said. "It just shows you where north is. Know where north is, and the weather doesn't matter." Nathan took it. He held it in his palm and felt the weight of it, which was solid for something so small. He did not fully understand what she meant. He thought he did, which is a different thing. He spent the next 6 years learning the difference. He met Claudia 2 years after the study in Westport. He was 38. She was 36. They were introduced at a dinner in Manhattan through a pair of mutual friends who ran in overlapping circles and had independently decided that Nathan and Claudia should meet. The dinner was in a restaurant in the West Village, a Thursday in October, and it was raining outside, and the table was warm and well lit, and Claudia Hartwell, as she was then, was sitting across from Nathan when he arrived, already in conversation with one of the mutual friends, gesturing to make a point with a kind of easy confidence that Nathan found immediately interesting. He liked her clarity, he liked her wit, which was sharp but not mean in the way he would later come to recognize as a Hartwell family characteristic. He liked the way she talked about her family with a kind of affectionate honesty that acknowledged their flaws without cataloguing them. She was working in event planning. She had built a small but well-regarded firm that organized corporate social events for financial services clients in New York and Connecticut. She asked Nathan what he did, and he said, with the easy understatement that had become habitual, that he managed a family trust and handled some investments. She said that sounded peaceful. He agreed that it was. She did not ask many follow-up questions, and he did not volunteer specifics, and neither of them found this remarkable. They dated for 14 months. He proposed in the study in Westport, in the house that had been his mother's and was now his, sitting by the window that looked out toward the water. Claudia said yes. She was moved by the choice of location. He had chosen it for reasons he didn't fully articulate, even to himself. By the time of the proposal, Gerald Hartwell's financial situation had already collapsed. Between 2015 and 2016, 3 over-leveraged real estate development projects that Gerald had staked much of his available capital on had failed in sequence. The losses amounted to approximately $200,000 in equity that had taken Gerald 25 years to accumulate. The Hartwells retained their Greenwich home, jointly held with a mortgage that was larger than it looked, and their social connections, which were considerable and carefully maintained. Gerald was skilled at managing the impression of his family's standing, which is a different skill from building it, and he had been practicing the first skill for long enough that it had become the primary one. Elaine, at 68 when the losses became clear, was in good health but requiring more support than the Greenwich home could provide. With the level of staffing the Hartwells could still afford, she needed care. She needed, equally importantly, to be seen to be in a certain kind of place. Harwood Estates in Ridgefield, a private luxury senior living community with monthly fees of $11,800, was the kind of place that the Hartwells could tell people about. The problem was the $11,800 per month. Nathan made the arrangement quietly in the second year of his marriage to Claudia. He told her that the trust's charitable structure could accommodate her mother's care costs, classified under a discretionary family welfare provision. He told her she did not need to worry about the details. Claudia thanked him and did not ask further. At the time, he had interpreted this as trust. Over the years that followed, he came to understand that it was a more precise kind of choice. Claudia had a talent for not asking the questions whose answers she suspected she would not like. She had developed this talent with the careful patience of a woman who had grown up in a household where certain questions were also not asked. Nathan had loved her in the beginning. He still cared, at this point in the story, about what happened to her. He had spent enough time in his mother's study in the years after Eleanor's death to understand that those two things, love and care, can coexist with a very clear-eyed assessment of what a person has chosen to become. He had the compass in his jacket pocket when he went to the trustees' meeting 3 weeks later. He had always had it. Frank Delgado called at 9:03 on that Tuesday morning in March. He was precise, and he did not spend time on preamble. Over the 18 months preceding the call, 23 distribution request forms bearing Nathan's electronic authorization signature had been submitted to the Trust's distribution processing system. The total amount requested and released across those 23 forms was $340,000. Nathan's actual authorization records for that period showed 31 distributions totaling $142,800, all of them within his standard submission patterns and submitted from registered devices. The $340,000 in fraudulent requests was separate and had been submitted entirely from a single unregistered IP address. Frank had cross-referenced the IP address that morning with the Trust internal records and then with external registry data. The address resolved to a residential property in Fairfield, Connecticut. The property was registered to Gerald Hartwell, 74 years old, Claudia Wren's father. Nathan said, "Go on." Melanie Cho, 33 years old, a forensic accountant who worked as an independent contractor for Ruth Kane's office, had been retained that morning and had already begun examining the request forms. She identified the formatting immediately. The distribution request templates used in all 23 fraudulent submissions matched, with almost no variation, the internal communication templates used by Harwood Estates for its resident support correspondence. The formatting conventions, the header structure, the specific fields used for the authorization workflow, all of it traced back to a template set that Harwood Estates maintained internally for trust-funded residents. Access to those templates required an internal Harwood Estates credential. Sandra Moss, 54 years old, was Elaine Hartwell's personal assistant and social fixer at Harwood Estates. She had been Elaine's practical ally for 4 years. She had a full internal access credential. She was, as far as Harwood Estates management knew that morning, simply the efficient woman who helped Mrs. Hartwell manage her calendar and correspondence. The $340,000 broke down in 3 categories. $180,000 had been submitted as additional living expenses supplement distributions across what the forms described as supplemental care needs. $95,000 had been transferred to a secondary account registered to a holding entity called GH Property Consulting, LLC, whose sole beneficial owner was Gerald Hartwell. $65,000 had been added to the Trust's support account as what the forms described as furniture, renovation, and suite upgrade charges for Suite 14B, Hall C, Harwood Estates. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What else?" Melanie Cho had, in the course of her discovery work adjacent to the fraud investigation, cross-referenced a subset of Claudia Wren's phone and email records, obtained through a legal information request submitted to Claudia's carrier in connection with the fraud investigation. The cross-reference had not been looking for what it found. What it found was a pattern. Claudia Wren and Dominic Firth, 38 years old, portfolio manager, had traveled together on 8 separate occasions over the preceding 14 months. 4 of those 8 trips were to properties whose reservation record showed that Claudia had booked the room. 1 trip was to a hotel in Charleston, 1 was to a property in the Berkshires, 1 was a 4-night stay in a rented house in Vermont in October, One was a long weekend at a boutique hotel in Providence. The receipts were in a folder. The folder had 47 pages. Ruth Kane's separate analysis of the Trust's 5-year distribution records produced one additional finding that Frank had flagged but not yet summarized. Of the 47 family welfare distribution requests submitted over the 5 years of the arrangement, 31 bore Claudia Wren's co-signature. The standard co-signature form for discretionary distribution requests included a disclosure box that identified the trust, its Delaware registration number, and the name of its controlling principal. Ruth's note to Nathan was direct. Claudia's signature appears on 31 distribution requests totaling $85,000 over 5 years. The standard co-signature form includes a disclosure box. She either read it or chose not to. Either way, the defense of "I didn't know" becomes very difficult to maintain in any subsequent proceeding. Nathan read the note. He sat with it for a moment. Then he called Ruth directly and said, "We do this correctly." Harwood Estates held 3 formal family events per year in its private dining room: Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, and the winter holiday gathering. The room itself, on its daily operation, served as an overflow lounge and a setting for smaller resident meals. On those 3 event Saturdays, the management pulled out the long linen tablecloths, set the baccarat crystal, called in the facility's chef and a supplementary catering team, and turned the room into what it had always wanted to be. Elaine Hartwell, in her 4th year at Harwood Estates, had been the primary advocate for expanding the Mother's Day event from a simple buffet luncheon to a full 5-course seated service. She had made the suggestion 2 years ago with the specific social confidence of a woman who understood that the right proposal, framed the right way, tends to be accepted. Management had accommodated her. Patricia Hewlett, 55 years old, CEO of Harwood Estates, had noted in her private management records that Elaine Hartwell was among the most socially active residents in Hall C, which elevated the community's morale and its programming reputation, and also among the most likely to produce remarks at social events that other residents would bring to management's attention afterward, which required careful handling. These 2 observations existed in Patricia Hewlett's records side by side because she was a thorough administrator. Elaine made her entrance to the Mother's Day luncheon 12 minutes after the first course had been served. She came in through the dining room's side door, which opened from the hallway nearest Hall C, and she came in the way she always entered a room she expected to be the center of. Without hurry, with a slight pause at the threshold, with her champagne silk dress, her posture, and the specific calm of a woman who believes that rooms arrange themselves to receive her. The table had been set with white peonies at the centerpiece. 10 tables, 40 guests, the ambient warmth of 5-course service, and a room that, on its best days, achieved the quality of an event at a private club. Claudia Wren, 42 years old, was already seated to her mother's right. Nathan was at the far end of the table in the window seat, which was the seat farthest from the head and closest to the afternoon light. Gerald Hartwell, 74 years old, was seated to Elaine's left, his silver hair brushed back, his blazer the precise shade of navy that said what Gerald Hartwell needed it to say about him. The first course was the asparagus velouté that the chef had introduced this year as a replacement for the traditional spring salad. Elaine received it without comment, which in Elaine's register meant she approved of it. "Nathan," she said as the server reached Nathan's end of the table and set the bowl down, "I understand Claudia has been mentioning your work to people. Managing a trust," she says. "That must be quite peaceful, not having to deal with the pressure of real business." She said it with the warmth of a woman who is offering what she considers a compliment. Gerald smiled at something on his plate. Nathan said the soup was very good. He took a spoon. The second course was a mushroom tart with shaved truffle. During the second course, Elaine described, to the table in general and to her 2 friends at the adjacent table who were listening, the renovation she had commissioned for her sitting room in Suite 14B the previous autumn. She described the wallpaper, which was hand-painted and had been sourced through a company she knew in New Haven. She described the new reading chairs, which were a William Yoward design. She mentioned the total cost, which was substantial, and she mentioned it with the ease of someone for whom the cost is not the point but the quality is. She then said, turning toward Nathan with the warmth she reserved for moments when warmth was most cutting, "The renovation was Claudia's vision entirely, of course. I hope you know that, Nathan. She has such a wonderful eye." Claudia laughed at this, a light social laugh that communicated she found the remark essentially accurate and a little charming. Nathan said he was glad it turned out well. He had not been consulted about the renovation. He was aware of it only because Frank Delgado had flagged the charges to the Trust's support account. The third course was a seared salmon with spring vegetables that arrived on white plates. By the time the third course appeared, Dominic Firth, 38 years old, had arrived. Claudia had arranged it. She had told the dining room's event coordinator that a family friend would be joining for dessert, and she had given his name and a brief description of him, and the coordinator had added a place setting at the table between Claudia's seat and Gerald's, which put Dominic 3 seats from Nathan and 1 seat from Elaine's left hand. He arrived at the moment the third course was being cleared, which was a timing that Claudia had calculated, whether consciously or not, to minimize the period of his presence at the table, during which anyone might feel obliged to introduce him to Nathan in a formal or sustained way. Elaine's reaction to Dominic Firth was immediate and visible. She turned to face him with the full warmth she kept in reserve for people she found genuinely promising. She asked him about his work. She asked him which events he and Claudia had both attended, repeating the story she'd been given that they were old friends from Claudia's event planning days. She asked him what he thought of the dining room. Dominic Firth was polished and confident in social settings, and he answered all of Elaine's questions with the pleasant, easy competence of a man who has always performed well in exactly this kind of room. Elaine looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who is allowing herself in public to make a comparison she has been making in private for some time. Nathan watched this from the far end of the table. He ate the salmon. He refilled his own water glass, which had been empty for a few minutes and which no one had noticed. A woman at the adjacent table, Meredith Cross, 69 years old, a retired attorney who had lived at Harwood Estates for 3 years, was watching the family dynamic at Elaine's table with the specific quiet attention of someone who has spent decades in rooms where the thing that is not being said is the most important thing in the room. Meredith Cross had a good memory and a habit developed over 30 years of legal practice, of writing things down when she witnessed them. Near the end of dessert, Elaine Hartwell raised her crystal wine glass. She said, "To the Hartwell women who have always known what they deserve." She looked at Claudia when she said it. She looked at the friends at the adjacent table. She did not look at Nathan. She looked past him with the specific grace of a woman who has been excluding someone from a room he is present in for long enough that she no longer has to try. The toast was received warmly. Claudia touched her glass to her mother's. Nathan did not touch his glass. He sat with his hands in his lap, and he looked at the white linen tablecloth, and then he looked at the window, and then he looked at Meredith Cross, who caught his eye across the width of the room at that moment and gave him a small, specific nod. The nod of a person who has witnessed something and will not forget it. As the table cleared and the event moved toward its informal conclusion, Elaine leaned toward Claudia with the particular confidential warmth she used when she wanted to be heard at a distance of about 8 feet. "The Hartwell name stands for something, Claudia," she said. "I know you know that. I just hope you remember it." Nathan heard this. He was putting on his jacket when she said it. He straightened the collar. He put his hand in the breast pocket, briefly where the compass was. He said his goodbyes with the courtesy that had characterized 9 years of Hartwell family events. He was the first one at the table to leave. On the Monday morning following the Mother's Day luncheon, Nathan called Ruth Kane at 9 o'clock precisely. He said, "We do this correctly, every step, every document, every procedural requirement. I want nothing that can be challenged later." Ruth Kane filed a litigation hold on all trust records that morning, a legal preservation order that froze the entire archive of the Whitmore Legacy Trust's distribution history, correspondence, and access logs against any modification or deletion. The hold was entered into the Delaware Court of Chancery's electronic record system by 11:45. Ruth had been filing litigation holds for 28 years. This one took her 40 minutes. She contacted the Delaware Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit at 2:30 that afternoon, submitting Melanie Cho's preliminary forensic summary as the basis for a referral. The referral was accepted within 48 hours. The Financial Crimes Unit assigned the case to an investigator who specialized in trust fraud. Ruth received the acknowledgement letter and forwarded it to Nathan without commentary. Ruth then prepared a formal demand for information to Harwood Estates Management Company concerning Sandra Moss's access credentials and her use of the facility's internal communication templates. The demand was sent to Patricia Hewlett's office via certified mail and via the facility's documented legal contact email address. Patricia Hewlett received it on Wednesday morning. She read it twice. She did not immediately understand its full scope, but she understood enough of it to call her own attorney before noon. The prenuptial agreement had been executed 9 years earlier, before the marriage, with both Nathan Wren and Claudia Hartwell, as she was then, represented by independent counsel. Ruth reviewed it on Tuesday afternoon. The agreement was clear. The Whitmore Legacy Trust, its assets, all distributions from it, and all financial decisions made in connection with it were classified as Nathan Wren's separate property in unambiguous terms. The agreement had been notarized in Nathan's attorney's office in New Haven on a Friday in October, signed by both parties, witnessed and filed. Ruth made a note in her case summary. Prenuptial agreement presents no vulnerability. Trust assets are separate property. Claudia's co-signatures on the discretionary requests constitute awareness, not ownership. The 90-day residency termination notice was a legal instrument Ruth prepared pursuant to Section 7.4 of the residency contract between the Whitmore Legacy Trust and Harwood Estates, which allowed the trust to terminate its financial support for any resident with 90 days written notice. Ruth drafted it, dated it, and held it in a signed but not yet delivered state, pending the completion of the legal process. The notice covered Suite 14B, Hall C, Harwood Estates, resident Elaine Hartwell. The monthly support amount, $11,800. The cumulative amount paid by the trust over 4 years of Elaine's residency, $566,400. The $85,000 memo was a formal legal document, not a note. Ruth prepared it based on her review of the 5 years of co-signed distribution requests and the disclosure forms attached to each one. Her conclusion, stated in the careful language of a trust attorney with 28 years of experience, was that Claudia Wren's co-signatures on 31 distribution requests, each of which included a disclosure form identifying the Whitmore Legacy Trust, its Delaware registration number, and Nathan Wren as its controlling principal, constituted constructive awareness of the trust's existence and of Nathan's role in it. This memo, Ruth noted, would be relevant to any subsequent divorce proceedings and would be entered into the record. Melanie Cho completed her full forensic accounting package on the following Thursday. It was 127 pages. The document traced all 23 fraudulent distribution requests transaction by transaction, with each request's metadata, submission IP, authorization timestamp, and destination account mapped against the trust's legitimate records. The $340,000 was accounted for to the last dollar. The package included the $65,000 in suite renovation charges, the $95,000 transferred to GH Property Consulting LLC, and the $180,000 in fraudulent living expenses supplements. Melanie Cho had also attached an appendix tracing the corporate registration of GH Property Consulting LLC to a Delaware filing submitted by Gerald Hartwell's personal attorney in 2019. Nathan reviewed the complete package on Friday evening. He made one amendment to the instructions. He asked Ruth to confirm whether any current staff at Harwood Estates, specifically non-management service employees, might be affected by a disruption to the facility's regular operations in the course of the legal proceedings. Ruth confirmed that the fraudulent distributions had all been to supplemental and discretionary accounts, not to the facility's core operating payment structure. The monthly $11,800 support payments to the main operating account had never been touched by the fraud. The facility's regular operations and service staff payroll were entirely clean. Nathan noted this confirmation explicitly in the operational record. Ruth submitted the full package to the Delaware AG's investigator on Saturday. She scheduled the trustees' meeting for the following Thursday. Before she did, she called Nathan to confirm the logistics. He asked one question: whether the court reporter could be present for the full duration of the meeting, including the reading of the 90-day notice. Ruth said yes. He said good. That was the end of the call. On a Thursday afternoon in late May, 3 weeks after the Mother's Day celebration luncheon, Ruth Kane arrived at Harwood Estates in Ridgefield, Connecticut, with a court reporter from a Hartford firm, a bound copy of the forensic accounting package, and a presentation file she had organized with the precision of a trial attorney who has learned, in 28 years of practice, that the arrangement of information on a screen can produce a silence that no spoken argument can match. She had contacted Patricia Hewlett 10 days earlier and requested the use of the facility's conference room, describing the meeting as a trust administrative matter requiring the presence of several principals and affected parties. Patricia had agreed and had then spent the following 9 days in consultation with her own attorney and the facility's board chair, Raymond Yost, 63, until she had a clear enough picture of what was coming to prepare herself for it. The conference room at Harwood Estates was a practical, well-furnished space on the administrative wing's second floor, with a rectangular table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted presentation screen, and windows that overlooked the visitor parking lot. On that Thursday afternoon, every chair was occupied. Nathan Wren sat near the window. He had arrived first, 15 minutes early. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he had the silver compass in the breast pocket. He had a glass of water and a legal pad and a pen. He did not open the legal pad during the meeting. Ruth Kane stood at the head of the table. Frank Delgado sat to her right with a second copy of the forensic package. Melanie Cho sat next to Frank with her own annotated copy and a laptop. Patricia Hewlett sat at the far end beside Raymond Yost. The court reporter was set up at a small separate table in the corner of the room, her transcription machine already running. Elaine Hartwell arrived at the meeting's start time in a charcoal grey dress, escorted from Hall C by Sandra Moss, who was present at Elaine's request, described by Elaine to the management as her personal assistant and social coordinator. Sandra Moss was wearing a beige cardigan and the expression of a person who has told themselves they do not have specific reasons to be afraid of a meeting and is not entirely managing to maintain that position. Claudia Wren arrived 2 minutes later and sat beside her mother. Gerald Hartwell had been invited and had not come. His personal attorney had sent a written communication stating that Gerald Hartwell would not be present at the meeting, and that all correspondence related to the matters under discussion should be directed to counsel. Ruth opened the meeting by identifying herself, her role, and the document before her. She read the name of the trust, the Whitmore Legacy Trust. She read its Delaware registration number. She read the date of its founding. She projected the trust document's cover page on the wall-mounted screen, the image filling it completely, and she let the room look at it for a moment before she pointed to the line near the bottom of the page that identified the controlling principal. Nathan Wren. Elaine Hartwell's face changed in the space of approximately 40 seconds. It was not a dramatic change, in the sense of an expression collapsing. It was more like watching a structure discover that the thing it was built on is not where it was. The pail that arrived was a specific kind, the kind that comes when 9 years of social architecture is reorganized without permission in a room with a court reporter and a presentation screen on a Thursday afternoon. Claudia's face was watchful. She held her expression with the controlled stillness of someone who has been waiting for a particular door to open and is not surprised by what is on the other side of it, only by how wide it has been pushed. Sandra Moss looked at the screen. She looked at her hands. She looked at the screen again. Ruth then moved to the forensic accounting findings. She introduced Melanie Cho. She brought up the first exhibit from the forensic package, a table of the 23 fraudulent distribution requests with their dates, amounts, submission IP addresses, and destination accounts. She walked through each category with the calm efficiency of a person who understands that clarity is the most powerful form of presentation. She named the IP address. She named its registered location, a residential property in Fairfield, Connecticut, registered to Gerald Hartwell. She named the template source, Harwood Estates' internal communication system, access credential attributed to Sandra Moss. She named the amounts $180,000 in fraudulent living expenses supplements, $95,000 to GH Property Consulting LLC, $65,000 in unauthorized suite renovation charges, total $340,000. She named the wire fraud statute under which the referral had been accepted by the Delaware AG's Financial Crimes Unit. Sandra Moss was very still. Elaine Hartwell's hands were folded in her lap. She sat with her back straight because sitting with her back straight was what she did, but the distance between what her posture was doing and what the rest of her face was communicating was, in that moment, considerable. Patricia Hewlett took the 90-day notice from her file when Ruth indicated the time had come for it. She read it aloud in a measured voice without pausing. Suite 14B, Hall C, Harwood Estates. Resident, Elaine Hartwell. Per Section 7.4 of the residency contract between the Whitmore Legacy Trust and Harwood Estates, financial support for the above-named resident will terminate 90 days from the date of this notice. The notice was dated that Thursday. Patricia read it once completely and set it on the table in front of her. The court reporter's keys were the only sound in the room. After a silence of approximately 8 seconds, Nathan spoke. He spoke to Patricia Hewlett, not to anyone else at the table. "I want to be clear," he said, "that no members of the facility service staff are involved in any capacity, and this process will not affect the facility's regular operations." He said it directly, and he did not add anything to it. Patricia Hewlett met his eyes and nodded once. Elaine Hartwell did not speak. After the meeting formally concluded, the room emptied in stages. Frank and Melanie left together. The court reporter began packing her transcription machine. Patricia Hewlett and Raymond Yost remained at the far end of the table, speaking in low voices. Ruth gathered her materials. Nathan stood by the window. Claudia waited. When the last person who was not Nathan or Claudia had moved into the corridor, she approached him. She said, "You should have told me." Nathan said, "You co-signed 31 distribution requests over 5 years, Claudia. Every one of them had a disclosure form attached. You made your choices." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "My father was desperate. You know what he was facing." "I understand that," Nathan said. "His attorney will make that argument. It doesn't change the wire fraud charge." She shifted. "I deserve half of that trust. 9 years of marriage. Whatever the prenuptial agreement says, a judge could still look at this and decide that 9 years of marriage entitles me to something from an asset I lived alongside." Ruth prepared 3 copies of the prenuptial agreement, Nathan said. "You signed one of them. Your attorney did too." Claudia looked at the table. Then she said, "Sandra acted alone. She had access, and she saw an opportunity. My mother had nothing to do with it." Nathan said quietly, "The request templates came from your mother's fixer's access credentials. We have the access logs." Claudia looked at the window for a moment, past Nathan's shoulder. Then she said, "Dominic is nothing. He never mattered. Whatever you think you found in those records, it was not what it looks like. The settlement agreement will include a confidentiality provision," Nathan said. "You don't have to explain it to anyone." She was silent. Then she raised her eyes to his and said, "You had 9 years to say something. 9 years. Why now?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I spent 9 years hoping the version of you I met at that dinner was still in there somewhere," he said. "I wanted to be wrong about what I was seeing. I wasn't." He paused. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and held the silver compass there, without taking it out. "My mother gave me a compass when she was sick. She told me it doesn't argue with the storm. It just shows you where north is." He looked at Claudia steadily. "I know where north is." Claudia did not answer. There was nothing in her expression that looked like she had not understood him. Nathan walked to the elevator at the end of the corridor, pressed the button, and stood facing the doors. He waited for the elevator without turning around. Sandra Moss was arrested at her apartment in Norwalk on a Monday morning, 11 days after the trustees' meeting. 2 investigators from the Delaware AG's Financial Crimes Unit arrived at 8:45. She was charged with wire fraud and forgery under federal and state statutes. The charges were specific, enumerated, and accompanied by the 127-page forensic accounting package that Melanie Cho had prepared. Sandra's attorney, retained that morning, negotiated a cooperation agreement within the week. Her full statement, provided in 2 sessions, was 84 pages. It named Gerald Hartwell as the originating source of the scheme, documented the specific communications through which he had directed her to obtain the trust's distribution request templates and submit the forged forms, and provided dates, message records, and account details. The cooperation agreement did not eliminate Sandra's criminal exposure, but it reduced it significantly. Sandra left Harwood Estates that same afternoon, her personal items in 4 boxes that she carried through the Hall C corridor, past 3 residents who watched without speaking. Facility management escorted her to the parking lot. Gerald Hartwell did not receive the news about Sandra's cooperation through official channels first. He heard it through a contact. 2 weeks after Sandra's arrest, a federal financial crimes investigator appeared at the Hartwell home in Greenwich on a Tuesday morning. Gerald's remaining personal assets, 3 brokerage investment accounts, a vehicle, and his equity stake in a smaller commercial real estate holding company were frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. His personal attorney, who had also filed the communication on Gerald's behalf declining to attend the trustees' meeting, advised him not to speak publicly. Gerald did not speak publicly. He did not speak very much at all for several weeks to anyone. The Greenwich home, jointly held with a mortgage, was not frozen because the mortgage exceeded its equity by a margin that made the asset primarily a liability. Gerald Hartwell spent his days in the house he could not sell, in a town where his social standing was based on an impression that the frozen asset notices were beginning to make very difficult to sustain. The morning after the trustees' meeting, Claudia received a message from Dominic Firth through the encrypted messaging application they had been using for 14 months. The message was 1 sentence. Dominic Firth had looked at the situation, assessed the mathematics, and communicated his conclusion with the efficient directness of a portfolio manager who has decided that a position no longer aligns with the risk profile he originally accepted. The sentence ended the arrangement. He did not call. He did not send a follow-up message. He did not, in the days and weeks that followed, make contact again. Claudia did not hear from Dominic Firth after that morning. She did not respond to the message. There was nothing to respond to. Elaine Hartwell spent the first week after the trustees' meeting calling the 12 people she considered her primary social contacts outside of Harwood Estates. 7 of the 12 returned the call within 48 hours. By the 3rd week, she had attempted contact with all 12. 3 had offered to have lunch. She accepted all 3 lunches. At the first lunch at a restaurant in Westport that Elaine had suggested, her companion was warm and asked interested questions and ate her salad with the thoughtful attention of a woman who was taking notes internally. At the second lunch in Darien, there was a moment near the end of the meal when Elaine mentioned Harwood Estates and the 90-day notice and the trust situation in the careful framed terms she had been developing, and her companion nodded sympathetically in a way that concluded the topic without engaging with it. The third lunch was the most useful of the 3 in the practical sense, because the companion asked whether Elaine had been in contact with a social services consultant who helped with transitions. Elaine had not been. She was given a name and number. She sat with it at her table in Suite 14B that evening and experienced the specific loneliness of discovering that the social warmth she had associated with the Hartwell name was, in significant part, associated with the address beneath it. The prenuptial agreement held. The divorce proceedings, when filed, were uncontested on the trust question. Ruth Kane had anticipated a challenge and had prepared for one, but the challenge did not come because Claudia's attorney, reviewing the document, the co-signature memo, and the 127-page forensic package, advised against it. Claudia received her equity stake in the Greenwich home, which was subsequently sold. She received her personal accounts. She received the 8 years of community property accumulated outside the trust over the course of the marriage, which amounted to a figure she was able to live on if she chose to live modestly, which she had not previously considered doing. She moved to a rental apartment in Stamford in September. She did not speak publicly about the marriage. She did not speak publicly about the trust, the trustees' meeting, or Dominic Firth. Meredith Cross, the retired attorney who had given Nathan that small, specific nod across the Harwood Estates dining room on Mother's Day, had not been an idle witness. She had a habit, established over 30 years of practicing law, of writing down what she observed in significant situations. A brief, factual account, dated, signed, and filed. She had begun writing her account of the Mother's Day celebration luncheon on the evening of the event. She completed it the following morning. It was 9 pages. It described, in the careful language of a person accustomed to courtroom standards of observation, the dynamics of the family table, the remarks, the sequence of events, the introduction of Dominic Firth, the toast, Nathan's position at the table, and Elaine Hartwell's behavior toward her son-in-law over the course of the 5-course meal. Meredith Cross submitted the account voluntarily to Ruth Kane's office 3 days after the trustees' meeting, accompanied by a brief cover note stating that she had heard from a colleague in the legal community that a matter had proceeded to formal proceedings and that she believed her account might be of use. Ruth Kane filed it as a sworn statement. It was entered into the public court record. Nathan made 2 arrangements before the 90-day notice period ended. The first arrangement was made through a separate charitable vehicle he had set up years earlier for exactly the kind of contribution he wanted to make without his name on it. He transferred $75,000 to Harwood Estates Employee Benefits and Development Fund. The transfer arrived as a bank notification in Patricia Hewlett's administrative inbox on a Wednesday morning. The accompanying note was brief. It said, "For the staff." Patricia Hewlett sat with it for a moment. She had spent the preceding weeks managing the facility's response to a complicated administrative situation, and had done so with the careful professional steadiness her position required. She read the note again. She filed it in the facility's development records and sent the standard acknowledgement of receipt. She did not share the donor's identity because there was no name to share. The second arrangement took Nathan 3 phone calls and a week of due diligence. He contacted a senior living consultant who specialized in assisted living transitions for Connecticut residents. He explained the situation without names, framed as a family planning matter. The consultant identified a well-run assisted living facility in New Haven with an excellent care staff, clean state inspection records, and a monthly cost of $3,400. Nathan reviewed the facility's most recent inspection report and its residency contract. He found nothing that concerned him. He instructed Ruth Kane to establish a structured charitable support arrangement through the Trust's Discretionary Family Welfare Fund, sufficient to cover Elaine Hartwell's residency at the New Haven facility for an initial 24-month period, administered without any personal connection or communication requirement. He did not tell Elaine directly. He had Ruth communicate the offer in writing through the facility's administrative office. Elaine received the written notification 11 days before her suite at Harwood Estates was to be vacated. The notification described the arrangement, the facility, the duration of the funded period, and the process for accepting or declining. It was signed by Ruth Kane on behalf of the Whitmore Legacy Trust. The trust's name was given. The controlling principal's name was not mentioned in that letter, but it was on the trust document, and Elaine Hartwell had now seen that document projected on a conference room screen. She knew whose decision this was. She did not respond to the letter directly. She called Claudia. Claudia did not answer. She accepted the arrangement 3 days later through the New Haven facility's admissions office. There was no direct communication between Elaine Hartwell and Nathan Wren at any point in that process, before or after her acceptance. There did not need to be. The compass, as Eleanor had always understood, does not require an audience. It simply points. On the last day of the 90-day period, Nathan drove from Greenwich to Ridgefield on a Wednesday morning. He took the route through Pound Ridge and came into Ridgefield on Route 35, which is a longer way but a quieter one. He parked in the visitor lot at Harwood Estates. He sat in the car. He had the compass in his jacket pocket and his coffee in the cup holder, and no appointment and no particular reason to be in that parking lot on that morning. He was not there to witness anything. He had nothing to confirm. He sat for a few minutes, watching a groundskeeper work on the garden beds near the facility's main entrance, and then he started the car and drove home. 6 months after the trustees' meeting, Nathan Wren was at the oak desk in his home office in Greenwich by 6:30 in the morning. The birch tree in the backyard had recovered from the winter. Frank Delgado's Monday report was in his inbox. The Whitmore Legacy Trust's investment portfolio, was returning 6.4% annualized. The fraud recovery process, by which the $340,000 misappropriated through the forged distribution requests was to be returned to the trust through the outcome of the federal fraud case, was progressing through the courts. Ruth Kane's October trust review was scheduled for the following week. Nathan read Frank's report. He initialed the 2 distribution requests in his queue. He made a note about a bond position that the investment committee had flagged in September and that now seemed to be performing more consistently. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the silver compass and set it on the desk next to his coffee mug. He looked at it. Eleanor Wren had given it to him on an August afternoon in the study in Westport 6 years ago, in the house that had been hers and was now his. She had been sitting in her chair by the bookshelves, with the window at her back and the light coming through it at an angle, and she had held the compass out to him with both hands and said, "A compass doesn't argue with the storm, Nathan. It just shows you where north is. Know where north is, and the weather doesn't matter." He had sat with that for 6 years. He had sat with it through a marriage, and through the particular kind of loneliness that comes from loving someone who has decided, somewhere along the way, that you are not worth the effort of being honest with. He had sat with it through a 9-year membership in a family that treated him as a financial inconvenience in good standing, tolerated at their tables because of a financial arrangement none of them understood but all of them benefited from. He had sat with it through a Mother's Day luncheon, at which his name was used as a punchline, and his wine glass went unacknowledged during a toast. He had sat with it through a forensic accounting package, a corridor conversation in which he said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more, and a drive home from Ridgefield on a Wednesday in May, during which he did not feel triumphant, because that was not what North felt like. The compass on the desk caught the morning light. It was a small instrument, worn to a soft matte finish on the edges where decades of hands had held it, lighter than it looked, more precise than it seemed. It had belonged to Eleanor's father before it belonged to Eleanor, and to Eleanor before it belonged to Nathan, and in all of that time, through all of those hands and all of those years, it had always pointed to the same place. It did not negotiate. It did not adjust its answer based on what answer would be most convenient. It had been telling the truth for 60 years, through storms and clear days alike, and it had never found it necessary to argue with either. Nathan picked it up and held it in his palm the way he had the first time Eleanor pressed it into his hands. He knew where North was. Not every inheritance is measured in dollars. Some of it is measured in what a man chooses not to become when he finally has the power to.